this lesson, we're going to talk about complex numbers and the quadratic formula. Complex numbers are the set of numbers created by having a negative number under the square root. In order to deal with these numbers, you need to know that when we have the square root of -1, we say that that is I for the set of imaginary numbers, also called complex numbers. What we do when we have a negative number under the square root is we split it up into the positive square root and -1 under the square root. So the square root of -4 is equal to the square root of -1 times the square root of 4. Since we know that the square root of -1 is I, we can take that separately. And we know the square root of 4 is 2. I times 2 is 2I. For the square root of -36, we take the negative under its own square root, so -1 times the square root of 36. So that's going to be I times 6, or 6I. The square root of -75. Since 75 isn't a perfect square, we're going to simplify it the way we normally would. But first we're going to take out the square root of -1. Let's try that again. The square root of -1 times, and then when we simplify the square root of 75, we simplify it into the square root of 25 times the square root of 3, because we know 25 has a perfect square root. So we have the square root of -1 is I, the square root of 25 is 5, and we can't take the square root of 3, so we write that 5 times I times the square root of 3. Remember that your radical needs to come last. We don't want to put the I after it, or it might look like it's underneath. For the square root of 30, we're going to take out the square root of -1, leaving us with 30. And then if we think about 30, are there any perfect squares that go into 30? And there aren't, so the square root of 30 itself doesn't simplify, but we can take out the negative. So that's going to be I times the square root of 30. Now let's do an example with the quadratic formula. We know the quadratic formula here, (b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. For this example, a is 2, b is 4, and c is 7. So x equals (b), so -4, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 4 squared is 16, minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is 7, all over 2 times a, which is 2. Now we simplify a little bit. (4) plus or minus the square root of 4 times 2 is 8, times 7 is 56. So we get 16 minus 56, which is -40, all over 4. Now before you learn about complex numbers, you would probably write no real solution, because that's true. There are no real numbers that work for this, but there are numbers from the complex set of numbers. So we're going to simplify the square root of -40, just like we did on the page before. That's the square root of -1 times the square root of 4 times the square root of 10. You can simplify 40 however you like. Here we get 2 times I times the square root of 10. So -4 plus or minus 2I times the square root of 10 all over 4. Now when we're simplifying with the quadratic formula, once we get to this point, if we want to simplify, we need to look at these three numbers. And if we simplify, the number needs to go into all three of those. And 2 goes into all of them, so this is going to be a 2, a 1, and a 2. So this simplifies to -2 plus or minus I times the square root of 10 all over 2. When we have negatives under the radical, we just take it one step further and pull out that square root of -1 and change it to an I. That's it.